Hello everyone, this is a video for the 6.13 lesson, New Realities. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the United States was attacked by terrorists and nearly 3,000 people were killed, the greatest loss of life in an enemy attack since Pearl Harbor in 1941. The world didn't change that day. There had been many terrorist attacks in many places in prior years, but Americans' perceptions of the world and its dangers changed. Vast oceans to the east and west and friendly neighbors north and south would no longer protect American soil. New reality meant new policies, laws, conflicts, and fears. Goals for this lesson. Describe the events of September 11th, 2001. Identify the Taliban and characteristics of its regime in Afghanistan. And describe the U.S. response to the terrorist attacks both at home and abroad. Don't forget to go to lesson resources and grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key. And there's also this additional sheet, Charting Future Courses. We're going to start with reading pages 947 through 953. Starting down here with Bush and global terrorism. When he first took office, President Bush tried to stay focused on his domestic policy agenda, particularly his proposed tax cut and changes in Medicare and education policy. Even as he assembled a highly experienced team of foreign policy advisors as members of his cabinet, the new president clearly envisioned his presidency as one that would be dominated by domestic concerns. But September 11th, 2001 would change everything. September 11th, 2001. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001 dawned a glorious day in both Washington, D.C. and New York City. Sunny, breezy, a pleasant relief from the long summer. On that morning, as commuters approached the two cities, reading their newspapers while riding trains and buses, or listening to their car radios, they learned about a weakening economy and the recent disappointing defeats for their pro football teams, the Redskins, Giants, and Jets. Readers of the New York Times pondered a front-page story about the efforts to improve dress codes in high school students because of a decline in good taste. At 8 a.m., many people in eastern airports were boarding planes destined for California. Two of those planes left Logan Airport in Boston, another left Newark International Airport in New Jersey, and a fourth left Dulles International Airport outside Washington. Among the passengers on each flight were 4 or 5 Islamic extremists with hateful and distorted ideas. They had been in the United States taking flight lessons, and they had no intention of going to California. A short while into each flight, the men rose from their seats, pulled out knives and box cutters, and announced they were hijacking the planes. They rushed the cockpits, assaulted the flight crews, and took control of the jets. The men were on a suicide mission, not in cars filled with explosives, but in airlines carrying thousands of gallons of highly explosive jet fuel. At 8:46 a.m., one of the hijacked planes slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City at nearly 500 miles per hour. An explosion ripped through the upper floors of the 110-story skyscraper, instantly killing hundreds and trapping hundreds more in the floors above. On the streets below, stunned commuters looked up in disbelief. The World Trade Center's Twin Towers, two of the tallest buildings in the world, were among New York City's most famous landmarks. Some 50,000 people worked in the World Trade Center complex, which housed businesses related to finance and international trade, as well as offices of several government agencies. Firefighters and police officers rushed to the scene, warning how such a terrible accident could have happened. Network news shows immediately began broadcasting live reports of the disaster. And here's a picture of the second hijacked plane moments before crashing into the other trade center, and another view there as well. Just after 9 a.m., millions of Americans watched in horror as a second jet plane crashed into the World Trade Center South Tower, setting off another huge explosion. At once, the country realized that this was no accident. Black smoke poured from the two skyscrapers. As the fires raged, people were burning to death and suffocating. Many, unable to find a way out, panicked and jumped to their deaths. At about 9:40 a.m., a third hijacked plane tore into the side of the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, just outside Washington, D.C. A section of the building collapsed, killing dozens. President Bush, who had been speaking that morning to a group of Florida school children, was whisked aboard Air Force One while the White House was evacuated. Just after 10 a.m. came reports of a fourth plane crash, this one in rural Pennsylvania. United Flight 93 had been off course and was heading toward Washington when it went down in a field. All 44 people aboard were killed. Back in New York, the unimaginable happened. The South Tower of the World Trade Center suddenly collapsed, imploding into the streets below and unleashing a blizzard of dust and debris. Within the hour, the second tower also came down, burying thousands in an enormous pile of mangled steel and concrete. The events of September 11, 2001 were by far the worst terrorist attack in the United States history. Before the morning was over, nearly 3,000 people had died, including many of the firefighters and police officers who were trying to evacuate the buildings. It was the largest loss of life in an enemy attack in American territory since Pearl Harbor in 1941. Around the world, people watched reports of the tragedy in bewilderment, outrage, and sadness. Across the United States, Americans were stunned, horrified, and desperate to learn who was behind the carnage. Who would do something so unimaginably horrible? And why did they want to attack the United States? And here's a picture of people in New York watching as the World Trade Centers were being attacked and falling down. United 93, let's roll. When terrorists seized control of United Flight 93, desperate passengers began calling for help on their cell phones. They quickly learned that other planes had crashed in suicide missions and realized their own plane must be headed for a high-profile target. Passenger Todd Beamer told the telephone operator that he and some others had decided to stop the hijackers. "Are you guys ready?" the operator heard him say. "Okay, let's roll." Minutes later, Flight 93 crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all aboard. Investigators believe the terrorists intended to crash into the U.S. Capitol building or the White House in Washington, D.C., but their plans were apparently thwarted by the passengers, who rose up to stop them. Oh, as somebody who lived through the day of September 11th, 2001, this is pretty emotional stuff. Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and the new terrorism. In the anxious days that followed September 11th, it soon became clear that the primary responsibility for the attacks lay with Osama bin Laden, the leader of a shadowy terrorist organization that spans several continents and many countries. Born the 17th child of a famously wealthy Saudi Arabian construction magnate, his early years were marked by luxury and privilege. In college, however, bin Laden became attracted to a radical form of Islam that blamed the West for the woes of the Muslim world. By his 23rd birthday, he had joined the Mujahideen, the armed Islamic resistance that opposed the Soviet troops in Afghanistan. The Reagan administration had funded the Mujahideen in their armed struggle against the Soviet Union, a policy that now came back to haunt the United States. Bin Laden spent most of his time raising money and recruiting fighters from around the Muslim world for the Afghan resistance. Young men from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Lebanon, and other countries rallied to bin Laden's call. In the late 1980s, bin Laden helped found an organization called Al-Qaeda, which is Arabic for the base. The group's original goal was to train fighters for the struggle in Afghanistan. When the USSR withdrew from Afghanistan in 1988, bin Laden exulted that his forces had defeated one of the world's two superpowers. After the Persian Gulf War of 1991, bin Laden came to perceive the United States as the greatest threat to Islamic nations. In his view, Americans were trying to dominate the Middle East in their greedy pursuit of oil. He resented the U.S. government's support of Israel. Above all, he hated the United States for stationing troops in Saudi Arabia, the holiest of Muslim lands, the land of Mecca and Medina, the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. In the minds of militant Islamists, the presence of Western troops on Saudi soil was the unforgivable offense against Islam. Outraged by the Gulf War, bin Laden enlarged al-Qaeda's goals. The major objective, he said, were to drive Americans and their satanic culture out of all Islamic nations, to destroy Israel, and to topple pro-Western governments in the Middle East. From a cave hideout in Afghanistan, bin Laden declared war on America. Addressing the United States, he proclaimed, "Terrorizing you while you are carrying arms at our land is a legitimate right and a moral obligation." On February 23, 1998, an Arabic newspaper in London published a declaration of the World Islamic Front for Jihad against the Jews and the Crusaders, a statement signed by Osama bin Laden and leaders of other terrorist groups. The declaration called for war against America and its allies, including Israel. "We, with God's help, call on every Muslim who believes in God and wishes to be rewarded to comply with God's order to kill the Americans and plunder their money wherever and whenever they find it. We also call on Muslim leaders, youths, and soldiers to launch the raid on Satan's U.S. troops and the devil's supporters allying with them." And here's one of these videos that bin Laden would publish on the Arabic Al Jazeera network, and that would be then brought forth on other networks as well. Operating out of a secret training camp in Sudan, Yemen, and finally Afghanistan, bin Laden and al-Qaeda masterminded and Al-Qaeda masterminded several attacks. In 1998, terrorists linked to Al-Qaeda simultaneously set off bombs in the U.S. embassies in the African nations of Tanzania and Kenya, taking the lives of 224 people, including 12 Americans, and injuring more than 4,500. In 2000, Al-Qaeda suicide bombers launched a raid against the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer harbored in Yemen. The assault killed 17 American soldiers. The American people were outraged by such attacks, but most were puzzled about the reasons behind them. The attacks seemed to be random acts of terrorism committed by distant fanatics. Despite the fact that American intelligence officers had grown increasingly concerned about the possibility of a serious terrorist attack taking place on U.S. soil, until September 11, 2001, most Americans knew very little, if anything at all, about either Al-Qaeda or the shadowy figure of Osama bin Laden. Mobilizing for a war on terror. After U.S. intelligence agencies determined that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were behind the September 11th attacks, President George W. Bush addressed the nation in a televised speech before a joint session of Congress. He declared that the United States would wage a war on terror until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. He warned Americans that it would be a long struggle. From this day forward, Bush declared, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime. U.S. intelligence reports indicated that Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda's training grounds were located. Bush called on the Taliban, the fundamentalist Islamic regime that had captured control of the Afghan government after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union, to turn over bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda leaders. When the Taliban refused, the United States, Great Britain, and several other nations joined forces to invade Afghanistan. On October 2001, U.S. and British troops launched airstrikes against suspected Al-Qaeda hideouts, while American Special Operation Forces, highly trained military units often sent on missions inside enemy-held or unfriendly territory, began searching for Osama bin Laden on the ground. The military campaign, officially called Operation Enduring Freedom, had another goal as well, toppling the Taliban. I'm going to go back to this other page to read this excerpt. Traitors to their own fate. In the tense days after September 11th, in some unfortunate instances, Americans failed to distinguish the terrorists from Muslims in general. Mosques in some American cities were vandalized. An Egyptian grocer was shot in California. At airport security checkpoints, some officials engaged in racial profiling, using race as a basis for singling out a person as a criminal suspect, when they pulled aside men of Middle Eastern ancestry, whether Muslim or not, and subjected them to extra inspection or interrogation. On September 20, 2001, in his televised address to Congress, when President Bush called for the war on terror, he made a point of emphasizing that the terrorists did not represent the vast majority of Muslims around the world. The President said, I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It is practiced freely in by many millions of Americans, and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. The terrorists are traitors to their own faith, trying in effect to hijack Muslim itself. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them. Western governments, including that of the United States, had once celebrated the Afghans who resisted the Soviet Union as freedom fighters, but Western governments and most Muslim nations were appalled by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which seemed even more brutal and repressive than the old Soviet Empire. The Taliban demanded strict adherence to Islamic law and forbade activities it considered offensive, a long list that included flying kites, playing chess, and dancing at weddings. The Taliban banned satellite dishes, computers, televisions, and any equipment that produced the joy of music, wine, statues, and Christmas cards. The Taliban destroyed many works of art and museum artifacts that they deemed anti-Islamic. For example, they demolished two huge ancient statues of Buddha that had been carved into a mountainside cliff thousands of years before, which had never offended other Islamic rulers. The Taliban depicted how people should dress. Men were required to wear beards longer than the grip of a hand. Violators were imprisoned until their whiskers grew long enough. Jackets, jeans, and other articles of Western-style clothing were prohibited. In public, a woman had to wear a burqa, a long cloak that hid her everyday clothing and covered her from head to toe. I'm going to stop here because the time's just about out and we'll finish in the next video.